Electroshock? Psychological surgery? No, none of the above. For 2 days, student volunteers at McGill University, where Dr. Hebb was chair of psychology, simply sat in a comfortable, air-conditioned cubicle, deprived of sensory stimulation by goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. If you look at the sketches and the photographs of those students, they look very much like those Guantanamo detainees that we saw in that film, and for good reason. Dr. Hebb himself reported that after just 2 or 3 days of such isolation, quote, the subject's very identity had begun to disintegrate. Discovery number 2, self-inflicted pain, what we now call stress positions. During the 1950s as well, 2 eminent cognitive scientists at Cornell University Medical Center, working under contract for the CIA, found that the Soviet KGB's most devastating torture technique involved not crude physical beatings, but simply forcing the victim to stand for days at a time. The legs swelled, the skin erupted in separating lesions, the kidney shut down, hallucinations began, all incredibly painful, and without not one single touch. After a decade of this mind control research, in 1963, the CIA codified its findings in a succinct, secret instructional handbook, the QBARC Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, which would soon become the basis for a new psychological torture paradigm disseminated worldwide over the next 3 decades. By the way, you might ask, what does QBARC mean? That's the CIA's cryptonym for itself. So the actual title is the CIA's Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. Now, if genius is the discovery of the obvious, then the CIA's development of this no-touch torture was a counterintuitive breakthrough, the first real revolution in the cruel science of pain in centuries. Through more than 2,000 years of Western judicial torture, the same problem persisted. The strong defied the pain, while the weak would say anything, whatever was necessary to stop it. In the 3rd century AD, when torture of witnesses was required under Roman law, the Roman jurist Ulpian called torture, quote, a delicate, dangerous, and deceptive thing. Everything that we have learned about torture in the past 2,000 years can be summarized in Ulpian's axiom, quote, for many persons have such strength of body and soul that they heed the pain very little, so there is no means of obtaining the truth from them, while others are so susceptible to pain that they will tell any lie rather than suffer it, end quote. Now, by contrast, the CIA's psychological paradigm fused these 2 new methods, sensory disorientation and self-inflicted pain, whose combination would, in theory, cause victims to feel responsible for their own suffering and thus capitulate more readily, more completely to their torturers. Refined through years of practice, the CIA's use of sensory disorientation relies on seemingly banal procedures, heat and cold, light and dark, noise and silence, feast and famine, for a systematic attack on the basic sensory pathways into the human mind. Now, in its clandestine journey across continents and decades, this distinctively American form of psychological torture would prove elusive, adaptable, powerfully seductive, and devastatingly destructive. Let's review each of these attributes because they are the key to the survival of torture to the present and maybe the key to its perpetuation into the future. First attribute, elusive. Now, unlike its physical variant, psychological torture leaves no traces. It leaves no clear signs of abuse, and it easily eludes detection, greatly complicating investigation, prosecution, or attempt at prohibition. After being trained by British intelligence, who had developed this doctrine in conjunction with the CIA, the Royal Ulster Constabulary applied these psychological methods on IRA suspects in Belfast in 1971 through application of the so-called 5 techniques of enforced wall standing, hooding, blaring music, sleep deprivation, and dietary manipulation. After articles in the press and questions in Parliament about what had happened in Belfast, a parliamentary inquiry headed by Lord Parker of Waddington found these psychological methods greatly complicated any determination of torture. Where, Lord Parker asked, does hardship and discomfort end, and for instance, humiliating treatment begin? And where does the latter end and torture begin? The answer, he said, turns on what he called, with great prescience, words of definition, and thus opinions will inevitably differ. Next, adaptable. In the 40 years since its discovery, the agency